This video is to say a few words after hearing of the passing of a good friend, not just to me but to so many people inside and outside of Elite. And in the background of this video is the system where he left his carrier and the last system that he visited. I first met Commander Z Drebin shortly after Distant Worlds 2 in 2019. It was on a Hull Seal call, and I was a member of the Hull Seals at the time. I joined them during Distant Worlds 2 when the Hull Seals were first created as a spin-off group from the Fuel Rats. Zed had called for help, and someone else had taken the call, but he said, "Come into the chat anyway and keep me company while I'm waiting to be fixed." And that's the guy he was, from the second I knew him. Friendly, welcoming, and inclusive. So I ended up in the chat room talking to Zed, and we carried on talking long after he got fixed about Elite and why we liked it. Zed always threw himself into anything he did, and he'd also spent a lot of money on the game. I remember him telling me he got a Valve Index for VR, and even had some plastic lenses made to go inside the goggles, which were copies of his prescription lenses in his spectacles, so that he didn't have to wear a VR headset with his glasses on, which is uncomfortable at the best of times. He went on to spend hundreds of dollars on expensive sticks and throttles and even a new high-end PC just to play Elite. Nice for those who can afford it, you might say, but spending money is still a choice even if you're earning more than the average bear. Yes, he did Yogi Bear impressions too. So for me, this was an early example of what I came to know Zed for, always looking to maximise his experience with anything he did. He even spent a whole year learning Flight Assist off, which takes a lot of time and dedication. Outside his gaming, he was a keen motorcyclist and diver. He'd often go out for long rides with friends and camp out for days, or just go on a long trip for the hell of it, and he travelled to many different parts of the world to go diving. He brought that same spirit of adventure to his gaming, and his enthusiasm was infectious, carrying you along with it. We were both on the Celebration of Early Astronomy expedition, run by Kazika, another great guy who puts maximum effort into his expeditions. The theme of his expeditions is always to relate them to astronomical discoveries in real life, so every place visited was accompanied by reams of information about its discovery and importance to astronomy, with Kazika's passion for the subject being a big part of the experience. Sadly, for various reasons, both Zed and I had to cut the trip short, but it wasn't long before we hooked up again, for the expedition's Stellar Unknown. There were a group of us on Stellar Unknown that met each night in the chat room and flew together. Zed, myself, Nad Darvis, Poppyfin, Phantom XT, Rex 1973 from the Fuel Rats, Nora Sparks, Enki, DJ Creep from Distant Radio, the radio station created for Distant Worlds 2, who was also a Fuel Rat, and many, many others. And we were just having a blast, flying around and chatting in Discord. Stellar Unknown itself has a sort of bad reputation because it was poorly organised, and many people left a few weeks in when it became apparent that the organiser had not done their groundwork or their preparation properly. This became obvious when we ended up visiting the same place twice. And it was then that Zed approached me and said, "Look, Phil, this has obviously all gone wrong. I think the organiser has issues and he's too embarrassed to admit he's failed, but I'm going to try and talk to him anyway and see if we can salvage something out of this or even help him. If I do, would you help me to organise this expedition and try and make it work?" And he was also asking everybody else that we were flying with. I said I'd try, but this was only my 4th expedition and I didn't know anything about organising one, nor did Zed or any of us, but he wasn't put off by that. If you're familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it reminded me of the bit where they steal a spaceship and Zaphod, Ford and Trillian are trying to make sense of the controls. And Zaphod says words to the effect of, "I don't know how to fly this, do you, Ford?" And Ford says no. "How about you, Trillian?" And Trillian says no. And Zaphod says, "Fine, we'll do it together." It felt very much like that, with Zed in Zaphod's role and the rest of us feeling more lost than Arthur Dent's towel. So Zed spoke to the organiser, and the organiser told him that the people who were supposed to have done all the scouting for him had let him down, messed him around, and basically left him in the lurch. And as Zed suspected, he was a bit embarrassed about it, and he didn't know what to do, or how to break it to people, or even whether to call the whole thing off. But anyway, he agreed to let us help. So Zed and the rest of us effectively became the new organisers on Stellar Unknown, and Zed put me in charge of scouting for the expedition to find new places to go and visit that we could add to the route, which I knew nothing about either. I spent a few desperate, panicky days searching around on forums and Reddits and websites and Discords, looking for information on how to find interesting stuff in the game. We were literally doing this as we went along. When you've only got this week to try and find places for people to go next week, while maintaining the illusion that you have everything under control, it really hammers home that preparation is everything, and it was a painful object lesson in how not to do it, but also a lesson that stayed with me. I learned a lot about expeditions in the process and exploring, which I carried forward into expeditions I was part of organising later. I might have gained those skills at some point had I ever been inclined to be an expedition organiser. I might not have. But what isn't in question is it was Zed's faith in me that first inspired me to try. Everyone we'd been flying with pitched in to help with scouting, documentation and support, and somehow we pulled it out of the bag, creating a second half of the journey with lots of great places to visit and turning it into a success for everyone who'd stuck around. And everyone who stayed with it while we took over said at the end that they'd really enjoyed themselves despite the shaky start. None of that would have happened without Zed's determination not to see a community event that we were all enjoying fail just because of a bit of bad organisation. And I've linked to the Stellar Unknown video I made below. And that was Zed all over. Anything he became a part of, he threw himself into, and it was important to him that not only he enjoyed himself, but everybody else as well. He never lost sight of what he was doing anything for either. He always kept his eye on the prize. He was also keen to know what others had discovered in his constant quest for knowledge, and at one point made a website called Terigwais, which means place of knowledge, to gather and organise the things he'd learned as a handy reference for other players. I would never want to go into an event as unprepared again as I did with Stellar Unknown. It was hectic, it was stressful, we were doing everything the wrong way round, but the sense of achievement when we pulled it all together and made a success of it, it's something that stayed with me and always will. Because in amongst the long hours, sleepless nights, and pressure to produce something in no time flat, it was also a lot of fun. And the camaraderie we all developed as we worked it out together is one of my most treasured memories of my time in-game. That ability to meet difficulties head-on and start organising a response to them, to think on my feet and put some kind of plan together, which Zed encouraged in me, that also served me well when the war started, and once again, everyone was caught on the hop by a completely new situation which we had to try and understand as fast as possible. After Stellar Unknown, we all stayed connected for a while and went on a few unofficial trips of our own. By this time the pandemic had hit and we were all in lockdown, and although the pandemic was obviously terrible, that sense of camaraderie came into play again as people from all over the game were talking and flying together, and for me, with a disabled partner to look after and only going out for essentials, the elite community became my whole social life during that time. Without all those elite dangerous players to talk to and fly with every day, getting through the pandemic would have been a lot harder and a lot more miserable. So, although the pandemic itself was obviously horrific, the friendship, the feeling of all being in it together, making the best of a bad situation despite all the tragedy, that's something I'm also going to treasure for what it was. The way it brought people together in that spirit of camaraderie that you hear about in wartime. Which it pretty much was. And worse, it was a war against an invisible enemy. Sometime after that, though, Zed felt he'd got all he could from Elite, at least for the moment, and moved on to Star Citizen, And we lost touch except for the odd message. But again, this was Zed. Once he felt he'd got everything he could from one experience, he was on to the next. It wasn't personal, it didn't mean he'd forgotten his friends, but when he needed to move on, he just did it. And he generally didn't look back, although he never ruled out returning if it captured his interest again. And he did make a brief reappearance when Odyssey dropped. He engineered himself a suit, he hooked up with a few players for a while. I never saw him during that time, unfortunately, and I suppose eventually he felt he'd given it another chance with Odyssey and still decided it wasn't for him, because sometime after that he stopped playing again and, well, presumably went back to Star Citizen. I'm not really sure, but even though we all drifted apart somewhat, none of us ever forgot our time together, and those of us who continued playing Elite always tried to carry that sense of camaraderie with us. Although Elite is technically a multiplayer game, the PvP side of things has no interest for me. Every single game online has been dominated by people who just want to kill each other as fast as possible, don't care about anything else, and frankly, it bores me to tears. What really makes Elite different is that the true power of the game is in cooperative play and the community it generates. It's also never been just about one thing. You can play in the sandbox or get involved in the lore and the stories. You can avoid the current war completely and travel the rest of the bubble or go out into the black. Everything is opt-in, not mandatory. New modules and ships and so on may get introduced due to what happens in the story. The powers and factions go through changes, but your sandbox experience remains largely unchanged. And when you have a sandbox like this, it's amazing what players come up with. Think of all the groups that have been created: the Fuel Rats, the Hull Seals, AX, Hauling, Rescues, Science and Exploration, the content providers and the streamers. All of these are things that players have come up with themselves. And most other games that allow factions or squadrons or guilds or whatever have the whole game revolving around that. Elite keeps it all optional while balancing things as best it can. And we can argue about how well it balances things all day long, but for me, there isn't another game that's managed it to the same extent. For example, I've been heavily involved in the war, but others don't care about it at all, and that's fine. I've never been into power play beyond doing the bare minimum to unlock some of the special modules like prismatic shields or pack hounds or pacifiers, so the upcoming revamp of power play only really interests me in terms of what it will bring to those who are into it and its potential for new storylines. And that's also fine. If something doesn't interest me, I can always find something to do in-game. And the game is its community. It's a community that makes this game what it is, what they've done with it beyond what the developers could ever have foreseen, and they've done it because of people's enthusiasm, continuing to drive them, even when there's been very little going on in terms of new content or activities. The game is what it is because of people like us, and especially people like Zed. And then this week we got the sad news that Zed has passed away. The details are not completely known at this time, but he was diving at one of the most dangerous spots in the world, which is also a treasure trove to explore, and whether it was some accident underwater or on the shore, I don't know, and in a way that doesn't matter. What matters is he's no longer with us. But at the same time as I'm broken up by this and I'm gonna miss my friend, there's one thing I know. He died doing what he loved, and whatever else he did with his life, he lived it. He lived it to the full and inspired those around him to do the same. When something like this happens and I lose someone close to me, I try to remember the good times, to celebrate their life rather than dwelling on their passing. That hurts enough by itself. And the lesson I will take from my time with Zed is this: no matter how dark things get, no matter how bleak things look, never lose your spirit of adventure. Never lose your joy of discovery. Never lose your love of learning. And remember to take time out from your busy life to have a moment for yourself, to rediscover your sense of wonder and appreciation of everything you experience, good, bad, and indifferent. Live your life and never let anyone tell you that you can't. Goodbye, mate, and thanks for being a great laugh and an even greater friend, for reminding us that life is for living, for everything we are today and everything you gave us. Thank you.